The dust devil that tore through Georgetown, Colorado, that August morning in 1878 scattered tumbleweeds and lifted skirts, but nothing prepared the townsfolk for the sight of a woman slumped against the weathered boards of Henderson's trading post, her belongings piled beside her like discarded furniture, a hastily scrawled note pinned to her trunk that read simply, "No longer wanted." Winifred Thompson had been conscious for hours, watching the sun climb over the Rocky Mountains while prospectors and ranch hands passed by without so much as a glance in her direction. Her traveling dress, once a respectable gray wool, hung loose on her frame after 3 days of minimal food and water. The stagecoach driver who had been paid to escort her from Kansas City to meet her intended husband had dumped her here instead, pocketing the remaining fare money and disappearing into the saloon across the street. The man she was supposed to marry, a mine foreman named Gerald Hutchins, had sent word through the driver that he had changed his mind, that he had found someone else, someone younger and prettier and with more money to her name. She pressed her palms against the rough wood and tried to stand, but her legs trembled beneath her. The high altitude made her dizzy, or perhaps it was the hunger, or the humiliation that burned through her chest like swallowed fire. 22 years old and abandoned in a town where she knew no one, with barely $30 sewn into her petticoat and winter coming fast to these mountains. "Miss, you all right there?" The voice came from above her, deep and concerned. Winifred tilted her head back and squinted against the morning sun. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of a well-worn hat. He wore dusty chaps over denim trousers, and a red kerchief hung loose around his neck. His boots were scuffed leather, and a coil of rope hung from his belt alongside a canteen. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice cracked on the words. He crouched down beside her, and she could see his face properly now. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water, green-brown and clear. A few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, and there was genuine worry in his expression as he studied her. "You don't look fine. When's the last time you ate something?" Winifred wanted to lie, to preserve some shred of dignity, but her stomach chose that moment to growl loud enough for both of them to hear. Heat flooded her cheeks. The cowboy reached for his saddlebag, which she now noticed sat on the ground beside him. He must have dismounted from his horse, which she could hear nickering somewhere nearby. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle and opened it to reveal thick slices of bread and dried beef. "Here, eat this." "I can't take your food," she protested weakly. "You can and you will." He pressed the food into her hands. "I've got plenty more at the ranch. Now eat before you pass out on me." The bread was slightly stale but tasted like heaven. Winifred forced herself to chew slowly, to not wolf it down like an animal despite her body's screaming need. The cowboy unscrewed his canteen and handed it to her. "Small sips. Don't want you getting sick." She obeyed, the water soothing her parched throat. As she ate and drank, she became aware of his eyes on her, not in a threatening way but with a kind of puzzled concern, as if he were trying to solve a problem. "I'm Austin Nash," he said finally. "I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles northeast of here, up in the valley. What's your name?" "Winifred Thompson." She wiped crumbs from her lips with the back of her hand. "And before you ask, yes, I was abandoned here, by a stagecoach driver and by the man I traveled halfway across the country to marry." Austin's jaw tightened. "That's a cowardly thing to do to anyone." "Yes, well, apparently I wasn't what he expected." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. His loss. Austin stood and offered her his hand. "Can you stand?" With his help, Winifred got to her feet. Her vision swam for a moment, and Austin steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "You got anywhere to go? Family here? Friends?" No, no one. The admission cost her something to make. Austin was quiet for a long moment, looking at her trunk and carpetbag sitting against the trading post wall, then back at her pale face. She saw the exact moment he made his decision, saw something shift in his expression. "All right then. You're coming home with me." Winifred blinked at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon, my ranch. You'll come stay there until you figure out what you want to do next. I've got a spare room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, will appreciate having another woman around. Lord knows she complains enough about being surrounded by cowboys all day. I can't possibly accept such an offer from a stranger." "Why not? You planning on sleeping in the street instead?" His tone was practical, not unkind. "Look, Miss Thompson, Georgetown's a decent town, but it's rough around the edges. A woman alone here without means or protection, that's asking for trouble. I've got the space and it's the right thing to do. Simple as that." Winifred studied his face, searching for hidden motives or danger signs. She had been raised to be cautious, to protect her reputation, to never put herself in compromising positions. But those rules seemed to belong to another life, one where she had prospects and family support and a future mapped out before her. That life had ended the moment Gerald Hutchins decided she wasn't worth keeping. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me." Austin picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and hefted it over his shoulder. "Don't need to know much. You're in trouble and I can help. That's enough for me. Now come on, we've got a ride ahead of us and I'd like to get back before the afternoon heat sets in." Something in Winifred's chest loosened, just a fraction. She bent to retrieve her carpetbag, and Austin led her around the side of the trading post to where his horse waited, a sturdy paint mare with intelligent eyes. He secured the trunk behind the saddle with practiced efficiency. "You ever ridden a horse, Miss Thompson?" "A few times when I was younger." "Good enough. We'll take it slow." He swung up into the saddle with easy grace, then reached down for her. "Put your foot in the stirrup and give me your hand." It took some maneuvering, complicated by her long skirts and her weakened state, but eventually Winifred found herself seated sideways in front of Austin, his arm solid around her waist to keep her steady. She tried to ignore the impropriety of it, the way her body pressed against his, the warmth that radiated from him. "Hold on," he said, and clicked his tongue to start the mare moving. They rode through Georgetown's Main Street, past the assayer's office and the general store and the two competing saloons that marked opposite ends of town. A few people stared as they passed, and Winifred kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to show shame. Let them stare. She had nothing left to lose. Once they left town, the landscape opened up into rolling foothills covered with scrub, pine, and wild grasses. The mountains rose dramatic and snow capped in the distance, their peaks cutting into the brilliant blue sky. Despite everything, Winifred found herself struck by the raw beauty of it all. Kansas had been flat and predictable. This was wild and dangerous and somehow alive in a way she had never experienced. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Austin's voice rumbled from behind her. "It is that. Harsh too, especially come winter, but there's nowhere else I'd rather be." "How long have you had your ranch?" 3 years now. Bought it from a prospector who decided he'd rather try his luck in California. Started with 20 head of cattle and built it up from there. Got about 200 now, plus horses. There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from hard-earned accomplishment. That must have taken considerable work. Still does. Ranch doesn't run itself. I've got 4 hands who help with the cattle and the horses. Good men, mostly, and Mrs. Chen keeps the house from falling to pieces and makes sure we all eat something besides beans and jerky. The mare picked her way along a narrow trail that climbed gradually into the foothills. Winifred could smell pine sap and dust and something else, something clean and sharp that might have been the wind coming down from the high peaks. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself relaxing against Austin's solid presence, lulled by the rhythmic movement of the horse. "Why did you come to Georgetown?" Austin asked after a while. "Besides the marriage, I mean. What made you leave Kansas?" Winifred was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for the complicated tangle of reasons. "My parents died last year within 3 months of each other. Father from pneumonia, mother from a broken heart, or so the doctors said. They left debts I couldn't pay. I had to sell the house, and even then there wasn't much left. I was living with my aunt, but she made it clear I was a burden. When Gerald's advertisement came looking for a wife, it seemed like the answer to everything, a fresh start, a new life. And instead you got dumped at a trading post." "Yes, instead I got that," she laughed, but it came out bitter. "I suppose I should have known better." The letters seemed too good to be true. He wrote about his important position, his fine house, his prospects, made himself sound like quite the catch. "Some men are liars," Austin said flatly. "Some men don't deserve what they've got. Way I see it, if he was fool enough to abandon you without even meeting you proper, then he saved you from a miserable marriage. Small comfort now, maybe, but it's the truth." Winifred considered this. She had spent the last 3 days drowning in humiliation and fear, but she hadn't thought about what life with Gerald might actually have been like. A man who could treat someone so callously, who could leave her stranded in a strange town without resources or protection, that was not a man capable of kindness or love. "Perhaps you're right," she said slowly. "I usually am." She could hear the smile in his voice. "Fair warning, I'm not much good at false modesty." Despite everything, Winifred found herself smiling too. They rode for another hour before Austin guided the mare through a gap between 2 rocky outcroppings and into a wide valley. Winifred caught her breath. A creek ran silver through the center of the valley, lined with cottonwoods and willows. Cattle dotted the grassland, black and brown shapes grazing peacefully. At the far end of the valley, nestled against a stand of pines, sat a house. It was larger than she had expected, built from logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and there were glass windows that caught the sunlight. Near the house stood a barn, a stable, and several other outbuildings. Corrals held horses, and she could see chickens scratching in a fenced yard. "This is yours?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "This is home," Austin confirmed. "The Nash Ranch, not fancy, but it's solid and it's mine. Ours, I should say. My brother Alden owns half the spread, but he's up in Denver right now working as a lawman. Sends money when he can, comes back a few times a year to help with the big jobs." As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the porch. She was small and sturdy, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was weathered but kind, and she wore a practical calico dress covered by a white apron. "Austin Nash, where have you been? I expected you back an hour ago. The beans have gone cold and—" She trailed off as she noticed Winifred. Her eyes, dark and sharp, took in the situation with quick intelligence. Austin dismounted and reached up to help Winifred down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he kept his hands on her waist until she steadied. "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Winifred Thompson. She's going to be staying with us for a while. Miss Thompson, this is Mrs. Chen. She runs this household with an iron fist, and we're all terrified of her." "Nonsense," Mrs. Chen said, but her lips twitched. She came down the porch steps and looked Winifred over with a critical but not unkind eye. "You look half-starved, girl. Come inside. I'll heat up the beans and make some fresh biscuits." "I don't want to impose," Winifred started, but Mrs. Chen waved her off. "If Austin brought you here, you're not imposing. That boy doesn't do anything without good reason." She turned to Austin. "Put her things in the spare room upstairs, the one with the east window, and tell Hank to unsaddle your horse. You've been riding her all morning." "Yes, madam." Austin touched the brim of his hat in an exaggerated gesture of obedience, and Mrs. Chen swatted at him before taking Winifred's arm and guiding her into the house. The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight. They entered directly into a large main room that served as both kitchen and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a long wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Shelves held dishes and supplies, and bunches of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Everything was clean and well organized, practical but not without comfort. Mrs. Chen deposited Winifred in a chair near the table. "Sit, don't move. You look like you might faint." Too tired to argue, Winifred obeyed. She watched as Mrs. Chen moved efficiently around the kitchen, stoking the fire in the cast iron stove, pulling out a skillet, unwrapping a cloth from a bowl of biscuit dough. The older woman worked with the confidence of long practice, her movements economical and sure. "How did you end up in Georgetown, Mrs. Chen asked without turning around. Winifred gave her the abbreviated version. The mail-order marriage, the abandonment, Austin finding her at the trading post. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally. "Men," she said finally, with such disgust that Winifred almost laughed. "Present company accepted. Austin is one of the good ones. Found me 3 years ago when I had nowhere to go after my husband died. Gave me this job, this home. Never asked for anything but honest work. There's not many like him." Austin appeared in the doorway carrying Winifred's trunk. "I can hear you, you know. All this praise is going to swell my head." "Your head is plenty big already," Mrs. Chen retorted, but there was affection in her voice. "Now go clean up and bring the hands in for lunch. We've got an extra mouth to feed." Over the next hour, Winifred met the rest of the ranch's inhabitants. Hank Potter was the oldest of the hands, a grizzled man in his 50s with tobacco-stained teeth and a surprisingly gentle manner. Jake Williams was younger, barely 20, with a shock of red hair and an endless stream of bad jokes. Tom Cruise was the horse wrangler, quiet and watchful, with skin darker than Austin's and eyes that missed nothing. The fourth hand, Bobby Garrett, was in town getting supplies and wouldn't be back until evening. They all treated Winifred with cautious courtesy, nodding their greetings and then focusing on their food. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast by frontier standards. Beans thick with molasses and salt pork, fresh biscuits with butter, strong coffee, and dried apple pie from last year's harvest. Winifred ate slowly, conscious of her stomach's limits, but everything tasted wonderful. After the meal, Austin showed her to her room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a window that overlooked the valley. Her trunk and carpet bag sat at the foot of the bed. "It's not much," Austin said, "but it's yours for as long as you need it. Mrs. Chen will bring up some hot water so you can wash. There's a privy out back, and if you need a proper bath, there's a copper tub we can set up in the kitchen after the hands turn in for the night." Winifred turned to face him. In the small room he seemed even larger, his shoulders nearly spanning the doorway. But despite his size, despite the gun she had noticed hanging from his belt, she didn't feel threatened. If anything, she felt safer than she had in days. "I can't thank you enough," she said. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me. Don't thank me yet. Ranch life is hard and winters here are brutal. You might wish you'd stayed in Kansas." "I doubt that very much." She met his eyes directly. "But I should be clear, Mr. Nash. I'm not a charity case. I'll earn my keep however I can. I can cook and clean, I can sew and mend. I'm not afraid of hard work." Something shifted in Austin's expression, a kind of respect. "I believe you, we'll figure it out. For now, just rest. You look like you haven't slept properly in days." He was right. Now that she was safe and fed, exhaustion was crashing over her in waves. She nodded, and Austin left, pulling the door closed behind him. Winifred sank onto the bed and let herself finally, fully acknowledge what had happened. She was in Colorado, on a cattle ranch, taken in by strangers. Everything she had planned for, everything she had expected, had evaporated. But as she lay back on the quilt and felt the mountain breeze drift through the window, she realized something surprising. She wasn't sorry. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Winifred rose with the sun, helped Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast for the hands, then spent her mornings learning the routines of ranch life. She gathered eggs from the chicken coop, churned butter, helped with the endless laundry that came from housing 5 hard-working men. In the afternoons, she mended clothes and tack, weeded the vegetable garden, and learned to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove. Mrs. Chen proved to be patient but exacting teacher. "If you're going to do something, do it right," she would say, making Winifred rip out crooked stitches or kneading dough that hadn't been worked enough. But there was kindness underneath the strictness, and Winifred found herself growing genuinely fond of the older woman. The ranch hands treated her with careful respect, always removing their hats when she entered a room, watching their language around her. Jake still told his terrible jokes, but he blushed furiously any time she laughed at them. Hank taught her how to read the weather in the clouds that built over the mountains each afternoon. Tom showed her which horses were gentle enough for her to approach, and warned her away from the half-wild Mustang stallion that Austin was trying to break. And Austin himself was everywhere and nowhere. He rose before dawn and often didn't return to the house until after dark, spending his days mending fences, moving cattle, working with the horses. But Winifred found herself increasingly aware of his presence. She would look up from her work to find him watching her from across the yard, or she would turn at dinner to catch his eye and see something there that made her pulse quicken. He was different from any man she had known. The boys back in Kansas had been soft, concerned with propriety and social standing. Austin was raw capability, all lean muscle and quiet confidence. He could gentle a spooked horse with his voice, repair a broken wagon wheel with his hands, track a mountain lion by its prints alone. But he was also kind, she noticed. He never raised his voice to his men, was patient with the animals, went out of his way to make sure Mrs. Chen wasn't overworked. 3 weeks after Winifred's arrival, a storm rolled in from the mountains. She woke to the sound of thunder and saw lightning forking across the dark sky. Rain hammered the roof, and wind howled around the corners of the house. At breakfast, Austin announced that he and the hands needed to ride out to move the cattle away from the creek, which would flood if the rain kept up. "That sounds dangerous," Winifred said before she could stop herself. Austin looked at her across the table, rain already dripping from his hat brim. "It's necessary. Cattle are stupid. They'll stand in a dry stream bed right up until the flood hits them, then wonder what happened. We've got to move them to higher ground. Then please be careful." Something flickered in his eyes, but he just nodded and led the men out into the storm. Winifred spent the day in knots of worry, starting at every crack of thunder, peering out the window at the sheets of rain. Mrs. Chen noticed but said nothing, just kept her busy with tasks, preserving the last of the summer vegetables, mending a torn quilt, preparing a hot meal for when the men returned. It was nearly dark when they finally came back, soaked to the skin and covered in mud. Austin's face was grim as he stripped off his dripping coat on the porch. "We got most of them moved, but we lost 3 head. Flash flood came down Copper Creek faster than we expected. Tom's horse stumbled and threw him, but he's all right, just bruised." Tom limped in behind him, favoring his left leg. Mrs. Chen immediately began fussing over him, but Winifred found herself moving toward Austin. "Are you hurt?" He looked surprised by the question. "I'm fine, just wet and tired. You're bleeding." She pointed to his hand where a deep gash across his palm was still seeping blood. Austin glanced down as if noticing it for the first time. "Must have caught it on some barbed wire. It's nothing." "It's not nothing. Sit down." When he hesitated, she added, "Please." He sat, and Winifred fetched the medical supplies that Mrs. Chen kept in a cabinet. She poured water from the kettle into a basin and carefully cleaned the wound. Austin watched her face as she worked, and she tried to ignore the way his proximity made her hands want to shake. "You've done this before," he observed. "I took care of my father when he was sick. I'm not squeamish." She wrapped clean cloth around his palm and tied it securely. "You should be more careful." "I'm always careful." "Then you should be more careful about being careful." She looked up and found his face very close to hers, his eyes intent. "Yes, madam," he said softly. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Winifred was acutely aware of her fingers still resting on his bandaged hand, of the way his hair curled damply against his neck, of the warmth radiating from him despite his wet clothes. Then Mrs. Chen called something from the kitchen, and the spell broke. As September arrived, the nights grew colder and the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold. Austin took Winifred riding one afternoon, wanting to check on a lined shack in the upper pasture before winter set in. He saddled a gentle bay mare for her and showed her how to sit properly in the saddle. "You're a natural," he said as they rode out of the yard. "Most city folks bounce around like they're sitting on a porcupine." Winifred laughed. "I'm not sure Kansas qualifies as the city, but I'll take the compliment." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, climbing into the foothills where the air smelled of pine resin and dry grass. Eagles wheeled overhead, and once they spotted a small herd of elk moving through the trees. The world felt vast and clean and full of possibilities. "I've been meaning to ask," Austin said as they paused to let the horses drink from a stream. "What are you planning to do? For the future, I mean. You're welcome to stay on the ranch for as long as you want, but I figure you've got your own dreams." Winifred had been asking herself the same question. A month ago, her future had seemed mapped out. Marriage to Gerald, a home in Georgetown, perhaps children eventually. Now that future was gone, and she found herself having to imagine something entirely new. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought perhaps I could find work in town, maybe as a seamstress or a teacher if they need one. But honestly, I'm in no hurry to leave. If Mrs. Chen doesn't mind the help, and if I'm truly not a burden, I'd like to stay through the winter at least." Austin was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the saddle horn. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were choosing each word with precision. "You're not a burden. You work harder than half my hands, and Mrs. Chen actually smiles these days, which is something of a miracle. The place feels different with you here. Better." Warmth bloomed in Winifred's chest. "It feels better to me too. Like home in a way I didn't expect." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Winifred felt the moment stretch between them, charged with something unnamed. But then Austin cleared his throat and nudged his horse forward, and they continued on to the lined shack. October brought the first serious snow. Winifred woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything blanketed in white that glittered like diamonds in the sun. The cattle had been moved to the lower pastures, close to the barn where they could be fed hay through the worst of the winter. The hands spent their days chopping firewood, repairing tack, and preparing for the long months ahead. Winifred found herself spending more time in the house as the weather turned cold. She worked on sewing projects by the fire, helped Mrs. Chen preserve and pickle everything they could salvage from the garden, and read from the small collection of books that Austin kept on a shelf in his room. In the evenings after dinner, everyone would gather around the fireplace. Jake would play harmonica. Hank would tell stories from his years following cattle trails up from Texas, and Tom would sit quiet and watchful, occasionally contributing a dry observation that made everyone laugh. Austin often sat near Winifred during these evenings, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They would talk in low voices while the others carried on around them, sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes, their views on everything from philosophy to the best way to break a stubborn horse. Winifred found herself opening up to him in ways she never had with anyone, telling him about her loneliness after her parents died, her fear of becoming a burden, her secret dreams of independence and adventure. "You're not the kind of person who could ever be a burden," Austin said one night, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You're too strong for that, too capable. I don't feel strong. Most of the time I feel like I'm barely holding together. That's what strength is. Holding together when everything in you wants to fall apart." He looked at her, firelight dancing in his eyes. "You've been through hell these past few months and you're still here, still standing, still finding reasons to smile. That's not weakness." Winifred felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for finding me, for bringing me here, for giving me a chance to figure out who I am." Austin reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "Best thing I ever did," he said simply. They sat like that until the fire burned low and Mrs. Chen shooed everyone off to bed, their hands linked, neither of them wanting to be the first to let go. November was bitter, with snow falling almost every other day. The ranch became its own small world, cut off from Georgetown by drifts that sometimes reached 3 feet deep. But inside the house, there was warmth and laughter, and a sense of family that Winifred had never quite experienced before. She and Austin had fallen into a pattern of working together on small projects. He taught her to repair leather tack, and she helped him with the endless bookkeeping that came with running a ranch. They would sit at the kitchen table after the others had gone to bed, working by lamplight, occasionally looking up to find the other watching. One night, frustrated with a particularly stubborn set of numbers, Austin threw down his pencil and ran his hands through his hair. "I hate this part. Give me a day wrestling steers any time over accounting." Winifred pulled the ledger toward her and scanned the columns. "You've got an error here. This column should add up to 247, not 242, and this entry is in the wrong category." Austin leaned over her shoulder to see where she was pointing, and Winifred became suddenly aware of how close he was, his breath warm against her neck, his arm brushing hers. "You're good at this," he said. "Much better than me. I used to keep the books for my father's store." She corrected the errors with quick strokes of the pencil. "Numbers make sense to me. They follow rules unlike people." Austin laughed, a low rumble she felt as much as heard. "Some people follow rules. Do you?" She turned her head and found his face inches from hers. "Depends on the rule." His eyes dropped to her lips, then back up. "And whether I think it's a good one." The air between them seemed to thicken. Winifred's heart hammered against her ribs, and she could feel the heat rising to her face. Austin lifted one hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "Winifred," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a question and an answer all at once. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly his lips were on hers, warm and soft and tasting faintly of coffee. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but when Winifred leaned into it, when her hand came up to rest against his chest, Austin deepened it. His hand cupped the back of her head, fingers threading through her hair, and Winifred felt like she was falling and being caught all at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Austin rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Only weeks," Winifred's voice came out breathless. "I've been thinking about it since the day we met." Austin pulled back to look at her, surprise and delight warring on his face. "Really? Really?" Even though I was half-starved and terrified and convinced my life was over, part of me was thinking about how handsome you were, which seemed extremely inappropriate at the time. He laughed and kissed her again, softer this time, sweeter. When they separated, he took both her hands in his. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" Winifred nodded, suddenly nervous. "I know we haven't known each other long, only a few months. And I know you came here because you had nowhere else to go, which means maybe your feelings aren't entirely your own. Maybe you think you owe me something, or maybe you're grateful, or maybe you're just scared of being alone again." He took a breath. "But I need you to know that I'm in love with you, completely, absolutely in love with you. And if you'll have me, I want you to stay here not as a guest or a housekeeper, but as my wife, as my partner." Winifred stared at him, her mind spinning. Part of her wanted to protest that it was too soon, too fast, too impossible. But another part, a deeper part, knew the truth. "I love you too," she said, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. "I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you first found me and offered me food without asking for anything in return. Maybe when I saw how kind you were to Mrs. Chen and the horses and everyone who depends on you. Maybe when you held my hand by the fire and made me feel like I was worth something again. But it happened, Austin. I fell in love with you, and it has nothing to do with gratitude or fear or desperation. It has to do with you being the best man I've ever known." The smile that broke across Austin's face was like sunrise. He stood, pulling her up with him, and wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Winifred laughed, giddy with happiness, with relief, with the sheer impossibility of it all. "Yes," he asked, setting her down but keeping her close. "You'll marry me?" "Yes." "Absolutely yes." He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. Winifred melted into him, into the solid strength of his body, into the promise of the future they would build together. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in Georgetown's church. Mrs. Chen served as witness, along with Hank, Jake, Tom, and Bobby. The young minister who officiated seemed charmed by the story of how they met, calling it providential that Austin had found Winifred at her moment of greatest need. Winifred wore a dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her alter from one of her nicer garments, adding lace from an old tablecloth and buttons made of polished horn. It wasn't fancy, but when Austin saw her coming down the church aisle, the look on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. "I, Austin Nash, take you, Winifred Thompson, to be my wedded wife," he said when the time came, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Winifred repeated the words back to him, her eyes never leaving his face. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Austin kissed her with enough passion that Jake whooped, and Mrs. Chen had to clear her throat disapprovingly, though Winifred could see her smiling. The ranch hands had arranged a small celebration back at the house. There was roasted venison and potatoes, fresh bread, and a cake that Mrs. Chen had somehow managed to make despite the limitations of frontier baking. Someone had brought out a fiddle, and there was dancing in the main room, everyone taking turns spinning Winifred around while Austin looked on with possessive pride. Later, after the celebrating wound down and everyone retired to the bunkhouse to give the newlyweds privacy, Austin led Winifred upstairs to his room, which was now their room. He had spent the last few days making it nicer, adding curtains to the windows, bringing in a better mattress, building a shelf for her things. "It's perfect," Winifred said, taking it all in. Austin came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I want to give you everything. A real house with fancy furniture and china dishes, travel to Denver and San Francisco, everything you deserve." Winifred turned in his arms to face him. "I have everything I deserve. I have you. I have this place, this life. I have a second chance at happiness. That's more than most people ever get." He kissed her then, slowly and thoroughly, and they spent their wedding night learning the landscape of each other's bodies, discovering new ways to bring pleasure and joy. They made love with tenderness and passion, with laughter and sighs, and afterward lay tangled together while snow fell softly outside the window. "Thank you for saying yes," Austin murmured against her hair. "Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with mud on his boots and cattle prices in his head." "Thank you for finding me," Winifred replied. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for giving me a home." Winter deepened, and Winifred settled into her new role as Austin's wife and the ranch's unofficial bookkeeper. She took over all the accounting, organized the supply orders, and even began corresponding with buyers in Denver about better prices for their cattle. Austin was amazed at her business sense, her ability to negotiate and plan ahead. "You're making us more money than I ever did on my own," he said one evening, reviewing the quarterly figures she had prepared. "We'll be able to hire another hand come spring, maybe even start building that proper barn I've been planning. We'll be able to do a lot of things," Winifred agreed. "I've been thinking about expanding the vegetable garden, maybe getting some pigs, and Mrs. Chen mentioned wanting to start keeping bees for honey." Austin pulled her onto his lap, nuzzling her neck. "Listen to us, talking about pigs and bees like an old married couple. We are a married couple, but not old, not yet." He kissed the sensitive spot behind her ear that he had discovered made her shiver. "I can think of better ways to spend the evening than talking about livestock." Winifred laughed, but didn't protest when he carried her upstairs. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the cattle grew fat on new grass. Winifred spent her days helping with the garden, riding out with Austin to check on the herd, and managing the endless tasks that came with running a successful ranch. She also discovered, with a mixture of joy and terror, that she was pregnant. Mrs. Chen guessed first, noting Winifred's morning queasiness and sudden aversion to coffee. "You're expecting," she said matter-of-factly one morning in May. "About 2 months along, if I had to guess." Winifred had suspected, but hearing it confirmed made it real. "I haven't told Austin yet." "Why not?" "He'll be thrilled." "I know, I just want to be sure. I don't want to get his hopes up if something goes wrong." Mrs. Chen patted her hand. "You're healthy and strong. Everything will be fine, but tell him soon. A man has a right to know he's going to be a father." That evening after dinner, Winifred asked Austin to take a walk with her. They strolled down to the creek, where the cottonwoods were putting out new leaves and the water ran clear and cold. "Is something wrong?" Austin asked, concern creasing his brow. "You've seemed preoccupied all day." "Nothing's wrong. Actually, something's very right." Winifred took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. You're going to be a father." For a moment, Austin just stared at her, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. He let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around just like he had the night they got engaged. "We're having a baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "We're having a baby." "Lord above, Winifred, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, though she could already see the answer written all over his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. I'm over the moon, I'm flying. I'm the luckiest man in Colorado." He set her down gently, suddenly solicitous. "Should you be on your feet? Should you be resting? Do you need anything?" Winifred laughed at his sudden concern. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass. I'm fine. We're fine." But Austin insisted on treating her like precious china for the next several weeks, until she finally had to put her foot down and remind him that ranch wives had been having babies for generations, without dissolving into helpless invalids. He reluctantly agreed to stop hovering, but she would still catch him watching her with an expression of such tender protectiveness that it made her heart ache. The baby arrived in early December, during a brief break in the weather when the snow held off and the sun shone clear and cold. Mrs. Chen served as midwife, with Austin pacing anxiously downstairs until the crying started. Then he took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting into the room to find Winifred exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle wrapped in soft flannel. "A boy," she said, smiling up at him. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs." Austin approached almost reverently, as if the baby might break. He looked down at his son, at the tiny red face and the shock of dark hair, and Winifred saw tears standing in his eyes. "He's perfect," Austin whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we call him?" They had discussed names endlessly over the past months but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at her husband holding their child with such infinite gentleness, Winifred knew. "James," she said. "James Nash, after your father." Austin looked at her, emotion working in his jaw. His father had died when Austin was 16, a good man who had taught him everything about ranching and honor and hard work. Naming their son after him felt right. "James," Austin repeated, testing the name. "Hello, James. I'm your father, and I promise you right now, I'm going to do everything in my power to be the man you deserve." The baby squirmed and made a small mewling sound, and Austin carefully passed him back to Winifred, who settled him at her breast to feed. Austin sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on her knee, and they stayed like that for a long time, a new family learning the shape of each other. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. The ranch continued to prosper under their combined management. Winifred's business acumen combined with Austin's ranching knowledge proved to be an unbeatable combination, and the Nash Ranch became known throughout the territory for quality cattle and fair dealing. James grew into a sturdy boy with his father's eyes and his mother's quick mind. He toddled after Austin from the moment he could walk, insisting on helping with chores, learning to ride almost before he could talk properly. Winifred would watch them together, her tall husband and her small son, and feel such fierce love that it almost frightened her. When James was 3, a daughter arrived. They named her Caroline, and she had Winifred's dark hair and Austin's easy smile. She was followed 2 years later by another boy, Thomas, who came into the world during a spring thunderstorm and seemed to carry that wild energy with him always. Mrs. Chen became a grandmother figure to the children, teaching them to cook and garden, telling them stories about China and her journey to America. The ranch hands remained steady presences, with Jake teaching the older children to fish and Hank showing them how to read animal tracks. Tom gave riding lessons with infinite patience, even when little Caroline insisted on trying to ride horses twice her size. Austin's brother Alden visited when he could, bringing gifts from Denver and stories of his work as a deputy marshal. He had married as well to a schoolteacher named Elizabeth, and their children would come stay at the ranch for weeks at a time, filling the house with noise and laughter. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Austin and Winifred would sit on the porch swing he had built, watching the sun set over the mountains. They would talk about the day's events, make plans for the future, or simply sit in comfortable silence, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "You ever think about that day?" Austin asked one summer evening when the air smelled of pine and wild roses. "The day I found you at the trading post. All the time," Winifred admitted. "I think about how scared I was, how certain I was that my life was over, and then you appeared like something out of a story and changed everything." "I didn't change anything. You changed it. You took the chance, you chose to trust me, you built this life with your own 2 hands." "We built it together," Winifred corrected. "And I wouldn't change a single moment of it, not even the hard parts, not even the scary parts. It all led here, to this porch, to you, to our family." Austin kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, bringing you home with me. Best thing I ever did, saying yes." As the stars came out one by one over the Colorado mountains, they rocked gently on the swing, content in the life they had created from abandonment and kindness, from chance and choice, from a cowboy's compassion and a woman's courage. The ranch spread out around them in the gathering darkness, full of cattle and horses, gardens and children, dreams realized and promises kept. Inside the house, Caroline cried out from a nightmare and Winifred started to rise, but Austin stopped her with a gentle hand. "I'll go. You sit and rest." She watched him slip inside, heard his low voice soothing their daughter, and felt gratitude wash over her like warm water. This was her life now, this beautiful, messy, perfect life that had begun with being abandoned and ended with being completely, utterly home. Years continued to pass in the way they do in places where life is measured by seasons rather than hours. James grew tall and capable, learning to run the ranch with the same skill his father had shown. He married a girl from Georgetown, the daughter of the mercantile owner, and they built a house on the northern edge of the Nash property. Caroline became a teacher, educating the children of miners and ranchers in Georgetown's small schoolhouse, though she rode home to the ranch every weekend without fail. Thomas, true to his stormy birth, became a horse trader, traveling throughout Colorado and Wyoming, always returning with tales of adventure and pockets full of profit. Austin's hair went gray at the temples, then silver, but his strength never seemed to diminish. He still rose before dawn, still worked alongside his hands, still treated every animal and every person with the same steady respect he always had. Winifred's hands grew rough with work, and lines appeared at the corners of her eyes, but Austin would look at her across the dinner table and see only the woman he had found at that trading post, the woman who had trusted him enough to take his hand and build a life. Mrs. Chen eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, and they buried her in the small cemetery on the ranch's eastern hill, overlooking the valley she had helped make into a home. The loss hit them all hard, but especially Winifred, who had come to think of the older woman as the mother she had lost. "She saved me too, you know," Winifred said at the funeral, standing beside Austin as the sun set behind the mountains. That first day when she took me in without question, when she taught me everything I needed to know to survive out here, she gave me purpose when I had none. Austin pulled her close. She loved you. She loved all of us. And we'll honor her by continuing to live the way she taught us, with hard work and kindness and no nonsense. They hired a new housekeeper, a young widow named Sarah who needed a fresh start just as much as Winifred once had. The cycle continued, the Nash Ranch remaining a place of refuge and hard work, of second chances and new beginnings. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Austin surprised Winifred by taking her to Denver. They stayed in a proper hotel with gas lighting and indoor plumbing, ate in restaurants with white tablecloths, attended a concert at the Opera House. It was grand and exciting, but by the third day, Winifred found herself missing the ranch, missing the mountains, missing the simple rhythms of home. "Ready to go back?" Austin asked, reading her expression perfectly. "Is it terrible that I am? After you went to all this trouble," he laughed and pulled her into his arms. "Not terrible at all. I'm ready too. Can't sleep properly without hearing the coyotes at night." They returned to the ranch to find everything running smoothly under James's capable management, and slipped back into their routines with relief and gratitude. This was where they belonged, not in cities with their noise and crowds, but here in the high country where the air was thin and clean and the sky went on forever. More grandchildren arrived over the years. James and his wife had 4 children in quick succession, keeping the ranch house full of young voices. Caroline married late, at 32, to a widower with 2 children of his own, and Winifred watched her daughter bloom into the role of stepmother with fierce pride. Thomas remained unmarried longer, finally settling down at 40 with a rancher's daughter from Wyoming, and they split their time between the 2 properties. Austin and Winifred grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They took to sitting on the porch for longer stretches, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, remembering their own children at those ages, marveling at how quickly time had passed. 72 years old, Austin said on his birthday, shaking his head in wonder. How did that happen? One day at a time, Winifred replied, taking his weathered hand in hers. Same as everything else. No regrets. She looked at him, at the face she had memorized over decades of marriage, at the eyes that still looked at her with love and desire and respect. Not a single one. You. Only that I didn't find you sooner, that we didn't have more time. We have exactly the time we're supposed to have, and we've used it well. They watched the sun set over the mountains they had claimed as their own, over the ranch they had built through hard work and smart decisions, over the family they had raised with love and discipline. The valley below was peaceful in the gathering dusk, cattle lowing softly, horses whickering in the corrals, smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. "Thank you," Austin said quietly. "For what? For saying yes. For trusting me. For building this life with me. For loving me even when I was covered in cattle muck and smelled like horses." Winifred laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as it had been 50 years earlier. "Thank you for finding me, for seeing me when I was broken and abandoned and thinking I was worth saving. For giving me a home when I had none, for loving me even when I was stubborn and bossy and insisted on reorganizing your entire filing system. You were right about the filing system. I usually am." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and they rocked gently on the swing while the stars came out one by one, and the night sounds of the ranch rose around them. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren being put to bed, their daughter-in-law singing a lullaby that Winifred had once sung to her own babies. The story that had begun with abandonment and desperation, with a cowboy's simple kindness and a woman's desperate courage, had become this: a legacy of love, a ranch that would pass to their children and grandchildren, a testament to the truth that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are doorways to the best things we'll ever know. Austin and Winifred lived to see their 75th birthdays, then their 80th. They moved more slowly but never stopped working, never stopped being essential parts of the ranch's daily rhythm. Austin still walked the property every morning, checking on the cattle and horses even when his grandchildren insisted he should rest. Winifred still kept the books, her mind as sharp as ever even as her hands grew more gnarled with arthritis. They passed within 6 months of each other, Austin first, in his sleep after a day spent teaching his youngest grandson to mend a fence. Winifred followed in the spring, sitting on their porch swing and simply not waking from her afternoon nap. They were buried side by side on the hill next to Mrs. Chen. Overlooking the valley they had loved, at the funeral, James stood before the gathered crowd of family, friends, ranch hands, and townspeople, trying to find words adequate to his parents' legacy. "My father found my mother at her lowest point," he said finally. And instead of walking past, instead of assuming someone else would help, he stopped. He offered kindness without expectation of return. He brought her home and gave her a chance to rebuild her life. But the truth is, they saved each other. She gave him purpose and partnership and love. Together they built something that will outlast them, something that will continue for generations. They showed us all what it means to take a chance on someone, to see potential where others see only problems, to believe in second chances and new beginnings. He paused, looking out at the valley, at the ranch that bore his family name, at the life his parents had built from almost nothing. They taught us to work hard, to treat people fairly, to never give up even when things seem impossible. They taught us that love is a choice you make every single day, not just a feeling that comes and goes. They taught us that home isn't a place, it's the people you choose to build a life with. And they taught us that sometimes the best things come from the worst moments, if you're brave enough to trust and strong enough to hope. The crowd was silent, many wiping tears, all remembering Austin's steady kindness and Winifred's fierce determination. The Nash ranch would continue, James and his siblings ensuring that their parents' legacy lived on in every fence mended, every calf born, every family given a second chance the way Winifred had once been given hers. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, one final time on the day of Winifred's funeral, casting the valley in shades of gold and purple, a young woman traveling alone on the stage from Denver looked out the window and saw the ranch spread below. She was running from a failed engagement, from a family that didn't understand her, from a life that had never quite fit. She had $10 in her pocket and no clear plan beyond getting as far from home as possible. The stage pulled into Georgetown just as darkness fell and the driver helped her down onto the dusty street. She stood there, alone and afraid, wondering what on earth she was going to do next. "Miss, you need help with your bags." She turned to see a young man, probably mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and kind eyes. He wore a cowboy hat and dusty chaps, and he looked at her with concern rather than judgment. "I'm James Nash," he said, tipping his hat. "My wife and I run a ranch northeast of here. You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to stay the night. If you need it, we've got room." The woman stared at him, remembering stories her grandmother had told her about unexpected kindness, about cowgirls who had built empires, about love found in the most unlikely places. She thought about saying no, about maintaining her pride, about handling everything on her own. Then she looked into James Nash's steady eyes and saw the echo of his father's compassion, his mother's determination, a legacy of second chances offered and accepted. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. I'd appreciate that very much." And as they rode out of Georgetown toward the Nash ranch under a sky full of stars, the cycle continued, kindness begetting kindness, hope sparking hope, the story beginning again in the way the best stories always do.